overcome by fear. I mean, I really get that. Every time this passage comes to the lectionary cycle, and I feel like God's calling me to preach it. I can promise you, Matt, I mean, have you ever jumped up and down for joy when this one came up? Not our favorite. And I think fear is a pretty reasonable response to our scripture passage today, because when it comes to witnessing about 6,000 demons being exorcised in front of your eyes, there might be a little bit of fear in that picture. I mean, when you think of that kind of power, that kind of fearlessness, that kind of miracle. And regardless of Jesus' identity, and remember, we have a couple thousand of years to get used to and accept Jesus' astonishing acts. Such a moment, I think, should indeed be a little bit of a cause for some serious alarm and apprehension. Because it's that kind of fear that combines both fright and hope, both anxiety and wonder. It's that kind of fear that explores that uneasy intersection between how can this possibly be and, oh, please, please let it be. And beyond the many layers of impossibility of this particular salvation story, deemed uncleanness, demon possession, ostracism, imprisonment, living among the dead, I mean, it's all here, is the chance that restoration is actually possible, that an outsider can actually become an insider. And maybe therein lies the fear of the tormented. Fear that it could be true, and fear that in what you have hoped, in what you have dreamed, you could be devastated all over again. After all, we've sort of become used to excluding those who we deem possessed, those who seem not to live within an acceptable sense of control, those who can't quite exist within the boundaries that society has so carefully established to keep order. I mean, what do we do with those people? And what do we do with ourselves if we happen to be one of those people? Now, most of us, when we are confronted with demon possession passages in Scripture, we hear them as dealing in some way with mental illness. And like so many other topics that we rarely address in worship, our silence may intimate that we find it difficult to pray for the health of the mind. Other ailments seem so much more worthy of intercession and the requested intervention of more spiritual souls. But I get a little bit ahead of myself, so let's enter for a moment into our text from today. We discover this text happening immediately after Jesus calms a major storm, prompting his awe-stricken disciples to ask, "Who is this then who commands even the winds and the water, and they obey them?" You all remember that scene if you've read the Bible at all, and it's just this first understanding that Jesus is something more than perhaps they had thought of him before. And so after this, that they sail then to the region of Gerasene, where they're confronted by a demon-possessed man. He's naked. He is so overcome by violent impulses that he cannot be restrained, even with chains and leg shackles. He's excluded from the city. He's living among the tombs. He shows all the signs that the ancients used to diagnose possession by an unclean spirit. And when he sees Jesus, of all people, he recognizes him and demands to know what there is between them. What does Jesus, the Son of the Most High God, have to do with him? And then isn't it interesting how he simply begs Jesus not to torture him? And one has to ask, is that the man talking or the demons? And the man himself actually might not know where his identity ends and where the possession begins. What is clear, however, is that Jesus is not going to allow the unclean spirits to keep on tormenting the man. Already, you see, even before the man addresses him, he's commanded them to leave. And it's only after that that Jesus asks the man's name. But it's the demons who reply. Legion, they say, for we are many. Well, now, until this point, the story sounds like a pretty simple healing miracle. But for people in the ancient Roman world, legion had only one literal meaning: a unit of approximately 6,000 Roman soldiers, the occupying army of their day. So suddenly this exorcism takes on social and political significance, and Luke's word choices throughout this story invite a closer look. You see, when the man confronts Jesus, Luke uses a verb that he employs elsewhere of armies meeting in battle. And when the demon seizes the man, that's a verb used elsewhere when Christians are arrested and brought for trial. The words for those hand and foot chains for binding and guarding, those are the same words that Luke uses in Acts when the disciples are imprisoned. In short, the language of this whole episode evokes the experience of living under a brutal occupying power. Furthermore, we discover the region of Gerasene is the setting of a horrific historical event. According to Josephus, in the late 60s, toward the end of the Jewish revolt before the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, the Roman general Vespasian sent soldiers to retake this region. And the Romans killed 1,000 young men, imprisoned their families, burnt their cities, and then attacked villages throughout the region. And many of those who were buried in the Gerasene tombs had been slaughtered by Roman legions. And when Luke wrote his gospel, that story would have been very, very fresh on the minds of the people who lived there. So when Legion, occupying the demoniac, encounters Jesus, it begs not to be cast into the abyss. Now, anybody else ever feel sorry for the poor pigs? I mean, if we take that story literally, that's just sort of a frightening picture. And surprisingly, Jesus just permits Legion to enter into this herd of pigs instead of being cast into outer darkness. Now we remember, Jews considered pigs to be unclean. So actually, folks, this detail is just a simple reminder that Jesus is in Gentile territory, and the story happens there. We do read, though, that the pig keepers, they witness this whole scene, and they run pretty quickly to spread the news. And when they return with people from both the city and the countryside, we discover that this liberated man is sitting calmly at Jesus' feet, clothed and in his right mind. And after hearing the story of how he has been freed, do the people shout and celebrate the good news? They don't. They don't seem to be at all happy about the freeing of this possessed man. Instead, overwhelming fear hems them in and holds them captive. And one can't help but think to them, freedom is just too dangerous and too costly. And though Legion has been expelled from the demoniac, the memory of Legion still controls this community. And so the Gerasenes simply beg Jesus to leave. And Jesus goes away, as they've asked, but not before he commands the man to return to the city and to explain what God has done for him. And the man obeys, we read, spreading far and wide the good news and the mighty work that God is doing in Jesus. So how many people like this man in our world are haunted by a traumatic past, perhaps even tormented by memories? How many live unsheltered and inadequately clothed because of social and economic forces that they cannot overcome no matter how hard they struggle? How many are imprisoned, regarded as barely human, excluded, and cast out? How many are enslaved by addictions, no longer knowing where the addiction ends and their own selves begin? Where do governing authorities around the world separate people from their families, denying them the opportunity to seek better lives? Where do occupying armies still brutalize entire communities and hold them captive to fear? Closer to home, in our schools today, where does the torment of bullying cause even the most wonderful child to question their worth? Jesus comes to challenge and to cast out every power that prevents us from living fully and freely as human beings created in God's image. See, Jesus claims sovereignty not only over our souls, but over our lives, right here on earth. And still today, God is at work in Jesus, bringing God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. But it is a work in progress, and that is nowhere more evident than in our understanding of mental illness. We all know where mental illness still stands today, even though it has vastly improved over the last 10, 20 years. It is still horrendously misunderstood. It is made responsible for all sorts of incidents by persons in relationships, even by leaders of nations, without any kind of empathy or understanding. It's still judged. It's stigmatized. So many feel it's best to hide it than to risk any additional chains that brand you unfit, that cause you to question whether or not relationships are possible, that make you wonder if who you truly are will ever be recognized again. And you get weary of the daily advice to just have a positive attitude. And you start believing in the empty platitudes that fall flat as soon as they're said. You question with just whom you could share your dark secret. Who can you trust, really? Those whom you thought you could believe in, you discovered couldn't handle it, maybe because of their own fear. And so sometimes when you suffer from mental illness, it's easier to live in the tombs, separated, disassociated from community, convinced that love cannot possibly be yours rather than to risk loving again. And that brings us right back to fear. I can't seem to shed the fact that this is the response to such a miraculous moment. A moment when the oppressed is actually freed. A moment when the one over whom you had control, even though in this case it was with chains and shackles, and let's face it, having control over others and yourself is a whole lot more comfortable than not having control. That is now let loose. Because what is it that the possessed man does once he's freed of his demons? Friends, we discover he can't keep quiet. And there's this moment when, by the grace of God, he could see this way forward from how can this possibly be to yes, please, please let it really be so. And that's what Jesus does. And he promised that he would do that from the very beginning. Remember Luke? Early on in his gospel, Jesus stands up and proclaims that God has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free. And when you are no longer chained, you cannot not shout and share and praise and worship. And maybe that's the root of our fear, that the good news will actually get out, that the good news shows no partiality and no partisanship, that the good news is truly for all people, even those that we have banished to the outside. To those of you who struggle with mental illness of one form or another every day, I want you to know that we can never fully understand the complexities of your pain or your life, but that you are not alone. We, your clergy, your community, we're here for you. We will sit with you in your darkness. We will cry alongside with you, and we will take your hand and lead you to the light of day when you feel ready. And we can also help you find the resources that you need. And for those of you whose loved ones suffer from mental illness, I stand in awe of you and all that you carry every day, and ask that God continues to strengthen and lift you as you care for the ones you love. May the earth beneath your feet hold you and nourish you and bring you sustenance. And may you know the acceptance of your community of faith as we walk together toward perfection. And friends, the strength of your community is real. It was real for me as a 15-year-old whose mother tried to commit suicide. And I struggled with my mom's depression for the rest of her life. And it was knowing I had friends in my faith that allowed me to be okay with that, to learn how to live with her and to love her and to repair broken relationships that happen when you deal with people who aren't always in their right mind. There's an acceptance here that embraces exactly who you are and leads to stories like one I would like to share with you today. A story about middle schoolers who show up in an amazing story of love, acceptance, and new ways of looking at one child who, until this story happened, had always been an outsider. Let's take a look.
Something unexpected happened at a rough and tumble skate park. It even caught the attention of the police. Here's Steve Hartman on the road.
How do kids behave when no grown-ups are around? Danette Mabes of South Brunswick, New Jersey says you never really know.
Because you're not watching him at that moment and at that time.
She had always just assumed her son was good.
Right.
Until recently, when 13-year-old Gavin Mabes got caught on tape showing his true character.
Oh my God.
Gavin and some middle school friends had just arrived at a skate park. The park was empty except for little Carter Brunel, who was here with his mother celebrating his 5th birthday. Carter is autistic. Big groups of older kids can make him nervous, so his mom, Kristen, was fully prepared to get him out of there. She just wasn't prepared for what happened next.
I don't know, they've really just shocked me. It was unlike any experience I think I've ever had.
You know how middle school kids sometimes operate like they're in a pack? Well, that's pretty much what happened here. Gavin led the way and the others followed. The only surprise was that Gavin didn't start trouble. He started a friendship.
This kid's already better than me.
Gavin's just going around with him and making him feel special. And the rest of his friends kind of followed suit and then started singing happy birthday to him.
Happy birthday!
That really blew me away. Because you just want to see the kindness in the world. And I wanted Carter to have a good birthday.
It was such a great birthday and such a kind deed. Even the local police department responded.
And we're going to throw you guys a pizza party next week over at school.
But here's the best part. Since their first meeting, Gavin and the middle schoolers have continued to go out of their way to play with Carter.
How you doing?
was just so happy, and he made us all happy.
So fun to be around.
Yeah.
He's rad.
Yeah.
And as for the moms,
You're awesome.
for them, this was a moment of parenting utopia, where the only thing better than seeing your kid treated kindly is knowing that your kid is treating others kindly, even when you're not watching.
That was so cool.
I was just so proud of him.
You want a race?
He's good.
You did it right.
Thank you.
Steve Hartman, on the road, in South Brunswick, New Jersey.
Some proud moms there. That's the CBS Evening News. I'm Margaret Brennan. Jeff will be back on Monday, and I will see you Sunday on Face the Nation. Have a great night.
One of the things that freedom provides us is the opportunity not to put people in chains and shackles, not to ostracize or set aside, not to turn the other way, not to avoid eye contact with that person on the street, but to joyously enter into a situation that God puts you in the middle.